While there is a world trend on the inclusion of persons with disability in this complex society, the rights of a disabled person in developing countries, particularly in India, are almost non existent, where the rights of a girl or a woman are also vulnerable. Women and girls with disability thus face twice the discrimination. Shanta Memorial Rehabilitation Center, a credible disabled persons organization (DPO) based in Orissa, India, along with Development Research Institute presents e-courses to increase knowledge on gender issues focusing on gender-based violence against women with disabilities, living independently and inclusion in the society from a human rights perspective. This web based course is titled Insidious Violence and Women with Disabilities. This academic endeavor was designed keeping in mind the COVID 19 restrictions and the shift of focus from classroom lectures to a virtual learning environment.
Our speaker for today will be Nilika Mehrotra from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Nilika is a social anthropologist who teaches at the Center for the Study of Social Systems at JNU. She's also the editor of the journal Indian Anthropologist. She has been a Fulbright senior researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, USA. She's authored several books. The two main books are Disability, Gender and State Policy, Exploring Margins in 2013, and she has edited Disability Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, which has been out recently in 2020 besides several research articles in the broad area of gender, disability, and development studies.
The speaker of this web course is social anthropologist Nilika Mehrotra from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, India, speaking on methodological issues in violence against women with disabilities research.
Thank you, Nandini. And my presentation is actually going to compliment Kathy's. Thank you, Kathy, for a very interesting and useful presentation. I'm going to mainly focus on India. And my presentation is actually drawn from my experience of working on gender and disability for over a decade. Some of it has come from my own personal research on gender and disability, as well as some of my PhD scholars' work who have been in the field, but none of us were actually focusing specifically on violence against women with disabilities. Um, but I would give credit to Professor Asha Hans and Kalpana Kannabiran, who actually invited me in 2015 or 16 to contribute a paper to CSD report 2016, where they asked me to write on violence against women with disabilities, and me and Mahima, one of my student and colleague, we started to put things together and review. And from there, some of the issues that I raise here actually emerged. In addition to that, we have both of us wrote another paper for a volume on gender and violence, historical and contemporary perspectives, which was published in 2019. And this also, looked at some of the concerns, especially regarding data and the methodologies of working with women with disabilities in the Indian context. So basically, what I'm going to speak about is methodological issues in violence against women with disability research. And this has, as I said, a reference to India and South Asia. This is not a particular research project that like Kathy's work actually indicated, but I'm going to just raise some of the issues of difficulties, challenge, and the prospects in doing work with violence against women with disabilities. What I argue in this presentation is some of the things that some of you may already know, but nevertheless, there's no harm in actually repeating that how when we work with the concept like disability, how we are constantly looking at the ideas of ability and normality. And but I think what is very important is that the larger context is of inequalities, and by focusing on body, mind, culture, social structures and policies, we are also, through the disability lens, we are trying to uncover the inequalities in the systems. So violence against women with disability research here has to be understood in terms of perpetuation of symbolic violence embedded in patriarchal structures against deviant bodies. So, why I write about this is that when we started to look at the evidence on violence against women in my own research and research of my students, as well as the available literature, what was very stark was that it was totally invisible, it was routinized, it was normalized, and we know violence against women as such is so normalized and routinized in our context, and in within that context, there was hardly any specificity granted to violence against women with disabilities. But I propose, and it has been proposed by many other disability scholars, that the body itself is a site for cultural scripting of stigma, discrimination, and body politics. And as Kathy also spoke about, that when we are looking at gendered violence and disability, an intersectional approach is really required. There has been, as I said, that there has been an invisibility of the disabled in the social science literature. Traditionally, in the Indian context, disability remained largely in the preserve of psychiatry, psychology, education, social work, etc. And they continue to be informed by biomedical models, and which focuses on the problem of the person with physical and mental impairments, and does not really look at as disability as a social issue. But in my own discipline, I realized in last 2 decades or so, there has been a contribution to disability studies in terms of providing critical ethnographic insights into biocultural material and the cross-cultural understanding of disability. So in disability research, in disability research on the whole, what we are trying to do is to reorient research. So again, questioning what do we know, what do we do, and how we do, and what we need to know. And there is a difference between studying disability, the way rehabilitation sciences or medical sciences, or even social psychology, etc. They look at disabled as subjects, to looking at doing disability research, where you work with people, you take people as collaborators and contributors to your research, which requires a total reorientation of theories and concepts, looking at where are the gaps in the theoretical insights, how concepts are lacking in the way we use them as heuristic tools to understand social science reality. So in this context, I feel that along with, say, other organizing principles like gender, caste, class, religion, ethnicity, etc., we need to also look at disability as an excess of inequality, which organizes bodies, which organizes materiality and symbolism around body and mind. Disability is also seen as a product of discursive processes in this context, and intersectionality as a very important theoretical tool to looks at the intersections between gender, caste, class, and disability. And to my mind, there is so little work on caste in our context, when caste is one of the major, organizing principle. And I would urge Indian researchers to actually look at the implications of caste and disability on the way we look at violence against women. There has been research in the recent past on the violence against women who from Dalit communities, and there is so little actually we get on within that context, that what happens to women with disabilities in Dalit communities. So class is another extremely important, religion, as Kathy also pointed out, and ethnicity. We don't know much about what is happening um, in indigenous communities, in Adivasi communities. We need more and more data to look at the violence there, because the violence is very structural, and gender and disability are very important intersections there. There are also important aspects about the researcher and the researched relationship. So as against the conventional mainstream research, we need to rethink the whole relationship between researcher and the research. And this is the most important ethical issue that we face. And RPD Act 2016 also, Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016 also, and later formulations also speak about how you cannot take disabled persons with disabilities as research subjects, and proper consent and proper protocols, research protocols have to be observed. Just a brief background to those who don't know much of the backdrop of how we look at disability and gender in the South Asian context. As we know, these are it's a very, very heterogeneous category, and the intersections between age, gender, caste, class, religion, rural and urban are extremely important factors out here, and which result in various and very diverse constructs of disability, with masculinity and femininity, the stereotypes, the gender ideologies, the roles have to be understood before we actually start to look at how violence is to be figured out. Disability is relational. It is embedded in kinship, largely managed within the families and communities. State support is very minimal. Still, it remains minimal. NGOs are, coming in and, trying to intervene. Nevertheless, much needs to be done here. Men in this context are usually, and the studies show that they are feminized or infantilized. And so there is, when we think about violence against women with disabilities, we also need to think about violence against men with disabilities, because they are also stigmatized to a great extent, because they are seen to be incapable of provide a role. And women in that context, they in my own fieldwork in rural Haryana, I found that they are just expected to work and reproduce. They are also the caregivers, so they are not seen to be persons with special needs or requirements. In South Asian context, most importantly, as Kathy has also pointed out, disability is a development issue. So poverty looms large in different ecological zones. So ecosystem approach is also very important here. So access to healthcare, education, work, and employment, these are some of the very, very important factors if we start to look at these issues. Then public spaces and institutions are largely inaccessible, both in physical settings and as well as in institutions. And we find that ethnographies are providing some kind of a material to understand this interface between gender and disability. And so when we start to look at violence against women with disabilities, the structural position of women is extremely important. So, which class you belong to, which caste you belong to. So there, and your access to resources, kind of determined to the way it is registered and addressed in both research and action. Okay, so what are the activist concerns? So when we started to look at, I work at this paper, so we realized that, activists mainly looked at women with disabilities as asexual or desexed. Women with disabilities were seen to be dependent, unable to get married. They were also understood to be incapable of becoming good mothers or good wives. And we saw in that video that, she takes a role as mother importantly. Women with disability with hearing and visual impairments are specifically considered to be incapable of mothering and parenting roles. Sandhya Lime has written about it. One of my students who is working with the blind women in Delhi also repeatedly, in her research narratives actually spoke about. So this kind of symbolic violence, this kind of a violence which is so invisible, comes through. But we, as a researcher, we have to actually look at it more, seriously, to actually figure out as violence. So researchers also look at this direct link between lack of education and violence. Concerns of violence against RPD Act finally, 2016 acknowledged this vulnerability to a certain extent. And this kind of, these sections include women with and children, and also contain sections related to abuse, violence, and exploitation. In the section on social security, health, rehabilitation, and recreation, it mentions that, sexual and reproductive health care facilities need to be provided for women with disabilities. Access to education and healthcare for survival are seen to be important issues. There are certain amendments also, as I mentioned here, in the criminal law, specifically dealing with aggravated sexual assault, and especially a rape committed on a woman suffering from mental or physical disability. And this is for the first time in the penal code history. Okay, so as far as the research goes, we found that the special is with special reference to, the nature of impairments and violence. As we have been talking about the heterogeneity of experiences of violence. So this important study by Ghai and Johari on the legalized killing of the disabled fetuses. So prenatal, killing of the fetuses is a very, very important concerns which has been raised in the disability community, which is substantiated by the research thereon. Then this constant reference to the state violence against women with mental disabilities, that is the forced hysterectomies and sexual violence against them in institutions. We have seen, especially the Maharashtra, the Pune infamous case, where which actually sparked off a debate on this whole question about the lack of agency of as construed by the state institutions on part of women with mental disabilities, and how state directly breaches into their rights. Then Reshma Valapian, in a very, very courageous and valiant efforts, she has written a great deal about how women with mental disabilities lack legal capacities. So, and this has been debated a great deal in the recent Act, Mental Health Care Act, and also the proposed amendments thereon. There is also evidence of widespread cases of sexual abuse of children with disabilities. Women with disabilities also often, face emotional abuse. Again, this perceptions of deviant bodies or not conforming to the regular bodies, name calling, gossip, stigma, prejudice, they result in specific types of research. This Kriya report is a very extensive, they have done extensive documentation about, the different nature of the violence which actually emerges out of social perceptions of them not fitting into the roles of a good woman or a proper woman. Then, as Kathy was also focusing, in Indian context also, we find that deaf and mute women and those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they are more vulnerable to sexual violence within families, communities, and institutions. They are seen to be powerless and incapable of reporting. There are extensive documentation of the fact that, since the police stations, they lack sign language interpreters, deaf women, evidence and their testimonies have been ignored, and especially if they are coming from poor communities, it kind of aggravates their vulnerability. So on one hand they are extremely vulnerable within the families and communities. On the other hand, even within the police station. So we did in the paper in CSD report, we for that we did a small survey of the police stations, and we found them totally insensitive to the requirement of deaf and deaf women and women with intellectual disabilities. Mobility impaired women, and Nandini's work, also especially with the severe physical disabilities, also are vulnerable categories. They are seen to be dependent. They are incapable of being seen as caregivers or contributors to the family life. So these constitute the kind of limiting their life chances, and we have seen that many women in this context, which the research speak about, they are unable to get married or unable to have the roles that are easily accorded to any so-called able-bodied women. And this question about lack of, for looking at them as asexual and not capable of entering into sexual relationships is also something which in the recent studies, especially Rising Flame, Nidhi Goel has been doing a lot of workshops with young women, and she speaks about how women, especially the younger women, have very little knowledge about their sexuality, and they are not seen to be capable of entering into sexual relation or marital relations. So, which kind of constrains their personhoods in a very specific way. Women with disabilities with visual impairment, especially, they are also seen to be at the receiving end, as touch is often their mode of learning and support. They report of inappropriate touch and sexual harassment in public places. This study being made by one of my students, and who talks about how these young women were constantly complaining of not only the so-called able-bodied people, but also blind people, in the pretext of helping them. They this constant, and they took it as a kind of routine, and only after some kind of awareness that they realized that they were being harassed. And Mahima Nair, especially her work on psychosocial disabilities, is very, very important. And there, she looks at how the social and economic factors, especially the macro factors, uh, increase their vulnerability. And so the women often complained of psychosomatic, distress and aches and pains and whatnot. And these are largely due to the fact that, economy is shrinking, their financial capacities are shrinking, and which is really telling on their bodies. So it's not just about, violence being perpetrated by in intimate settings, but also that how the larger, social and economic settings also, puts kind of creates these very disabling conditions within which women, especially in the poorer communities, they constantly express of violence, which they are not able to verbalize as violence, but they are complaining of constant illness and fatigue and other psychosocial symptoms. So what are the, as I said that, there are methodological challenges. So one very, very important challenge is the fact that, unless you, what do we do if we are not really specifically focusing on violence against women with disabilities? So any research, any especially qualitative or quantitative research, should it or not, include aspects of looking at in specific terms about, what constitutes violence against women with disabilities. So reorienting, refiguring theories and methodologies. Like, for instance, one of my students who was working with deaf children in Delhi, and she learned sign language for that. And she realized that many children who are, especially the girl children, who are not able to come and, talk to her, and this is in the pre-COVID context, they would make video calls to her, and constantly, they would come on video call through sign language, they complained to her about the constraints that the family imposed on them. So, in every research, you require to reorient, the methodologies to understand, what is going on. So you need, I remember in women's studies, when we started off, we would say that, you require a much more closer, deeper engagement with your participants. Here, when the violence is seen to be so normalized, thinking that, we talk to people and they are going to talk about violence, probably they don't realize what is meant by violence in their context. So you require a certain kind of, very improvised way of looking at, or, doing, improvising your tools to actually to figure out, what is happening in their lives. Another very important issue in this context, in the Indian context, is that we have very little literature still. Although in last 10 years, there's a lot of literature has come up on gender and disability, still we require more critical, perspective, and especially on violence against women. I know Asha ji and Nandini are doing this project. They are a part of this alliance. Renu Adlakha is doing from Center for Women's Development Studies, and we need to see, what are the kind of findings that they have come up with. There are also fewer scholars with disability experience. So I think it is also very important that, people with disabilities become participants, and also they are the ones who should shape the research. So this is like, this has to kind of go on. This is a long process, and we are, all in this together. Then academic research also has little linkage with disability movements and DPOs. I'm very happy to see Kathy's work and Nandini and others' work, that there is a very strong link out there. But as we know that much of the Indian research remains very insulated and isolated. So, unless we work with DPOs and disability movements, we have one foot there and one foot there, and we are trying to learn from each other, mutually influence and shape the agenda. Very little understanding is going to come by. Police, judicial bodies, bureaucracies, they lack disability awareness. This is very clear. So, in our qualitative studies, I think it is very important not only to talk to people with disabilities, but also with people who are the implementer, who are the executors, who totally lack disability awareness. So more and more, like we have these gender orientation programs. I think we need to have gender and disability intersectional orientation programs for the police and the judicial bodies, because how to make them understand that people with disabilities have agency and they have a voice, and it needs to be understood. So how to implement RPD Act in its important in its totality would depend on how much of effort actually the state and the civil society organizations take in this regard. Then we also need to understand the impact of globalization, media, and technology on people. For instance, we found in our recent researches on gender and disability that how media is changing their lives, lives of women with disabilities, and especially middle class women. And it is they are also they also face online bullying and a lot of harassment, sexual harassment in the virtual sphere. But another point is also about digital divide, that many people don't have access. So we are in a situation of larger inequality, that some have very good access and others don't have. And especially during the COVID times, this has become so evident that this digital divide is creating more issues. And so this in our research we also need to actually factor in media, technology, and information, the flow of information, and also the capital locally, nationally, and globally. So it also kind of, we have seen that it has created these networks. And we are sitting in this meeting, which is also a global part of the global network. So people who are outside of academia or activism also, they are mired in these global materialities. And we need to figure out through our research that how do we understand the implications of global flows on them. So this would be a very important agenda of research. Here we also I see that ethnography is becoming very popular. But it needs to be taken forward, looking at more critically. So for instance, only description and documentation is not sufficient. I think ethnographies should lead to more understanding the social reality. So from observation we move to interpretation. We need to figure out how material and symbolic realities within which people are embedded, especially people with disabilities are embedded, how to figure that out. So there is a tendency in many of the NGO sector, especially I've noticed that they tend to take ethnography in its very conventional mainstream understanding. But ethnography within the social science academia, we know it has moved away far away from its very technical meaning. So feminist ethnography, feminist disability ethnography, there are many ways in which we look at ethnography as a tool. So here ethnography, as I mentioned earlier also, it needs to encompass a much larger universe. So it is not just about working with women with disabilities, but also about all stakeholders. So we need to deconstruct the state and other agencies. So I'll give you an example of, I was in one design, especially architecture workshop, where one speaker spoke about how they were making these disability accessible toilets for people with disabilities in a slum in Ahmedabad. And I raised this question about that, is if there was a sufficient supply of water to the slum. And to this the answer was that I'm not concerned where the water is going to come from. So I'm only concerned with providing an accessible technology and accessible design to them. So what kind of a research it is, where you are not really concerned with whether this kind of a planning is going to actually germinate any fruits or not. So it requires that we make state and other agencies also accountable. Otherwise, such research will remain very incomplete, and it won't wield any results, because people are not going to use the toilets if you don't have a proper supply of water. And we know what is the condition in our slums in our cities. Similarly, as anthropologists, we work with the concept of culture. So especially in Bourdieu's terms, looking at it as a very heterogeneous social reality, from homogeneous to very contested and conflictual one, where power is a very, very important aspect. So who wields power over whom? So within the this violence against women with disabilities also, often we see especially there is a lot of focus on the partner, but there is very little focus on other members of the family and communities. So for instance, what happens if a woman, in one of the case studies which I am reminded of from Kriya report, where this woman who's unmarried with cerebral palsy living with the brother and his family, and she's facing violence from them, and largely emotional violence from them. So how do we look at other relationships? So I raised this question about the kinship ideology. We need to understand the context within which this the violence has to be understood. So the context, as I said, is extremely important. So what are the future agendas out here? So as in disability research, we are constantly talking about moving away from medical to social and post-structuralist model, where body is also very important. Especially I have in mind, later I speak about this chronic illness, aging, etc., where body and the structure, the social structures, they both have to be seen in interface with each other in order to figure out what is happening in a particular situation. And the focus on inequality, so from personal tragedy and charity model to models which are based on social justice and equality. One kind of especially those who are coming from humanities and other disciplines, allied disciplines, they are constantly they are studying media, they are studying cultural representation, but it has to go further. We cannot just talk in negative or positive terms. We need to also look at ambivalent assumptions about how disability is kind of represented, since it is based in the Eastern India, your workshop. One of the examples that I often quote is of Lord Jagannath and his siblings, that, their bodies are incomplete, but they are the, like especially in the Odisha, they are the state deities. So in some sense, these ambivalent perceptions of the god and the goddesses, and what are its implications for everyday life for people. So we need to also understand this, ableism and disableism as it kind of works in real life. And it has within these, you have the elements of violence which need to be, highlighted. Then the focus on disease, illness, and cure to disabling conditions, physical, social environments. I spoke about the ecological settings and disability cultures. So, like in Odisha, for instance, millions of tribals have been displaced, and they have lost their livelihood, they have lost their habitats, and there is very little actually research on what happens to them in terms of their psychosocial implications, in terms of their physical well-being, etc. So there is so much of scope of doing research on indigenous communities, and especially how and these constant disasters that Odisha and the Eastern India often experiences, how it kind of works. And we have seen in earlier research, like in tsunami, etc., that how violence increases post disaster. So what happens, and disasters leave a lot of people with disabilities and psychosocial impairments. And so we need documentation, we need more research on these aspects. At if there are any disability cultures at all, in Indian context, we know that disability communities are emerging, but are there any disability cultures? We need to also explore that. The agenda, I think, should include chronic illness and pain. And this kind of this is very, very important in terms of its gender and disability implications. Aging, the way it is experienced in across communities, mental and developmental disabilities. So we don't have data, we don't have evidence. We need more and more evidence to understand how these disabilities are understood, how they are coped with, how they are negotiated with, what are the kind of support structures. There is some research on care work, but I think we need more, we need much more. Then the role of technology and personal and rehabilitation also. Disability studies somewhere or the other is informing the rehabilitation studies. So do we have material? Do we know how people in rehabilitation sciences are actually taking critical disability, perspectives or not? So we need to engage. So medical humanities is one, field where some research is going on in this field. Okay. So there are also, these issues of capabilities, citizenship, rights, and law. So RPD Act 2016, we need cases, we need narratives about, whether there is a lot of effort there in enabling capacities, especially legal capacities of people. So how many of the people with disabilities, especially women with disabilities, are able to report, say, about violence? How many are able to go to police? How many are able to actually give their testimonies in courts, etc.? So you require more and more. Then there are issues about LGBT people, which some research is coming in, that who are further marginal to this whole debate. So in some sense, we require these things to be put together. That is why my effort was actually to bring in different disciplines together, and develop a kind of interdisciplinary perspective which is rooted in the South Asian context, which is where we take from the challenges and the possibilities in the Indian and South Asian context, using interdisciplinary methodologies and conceptions, etc. But there is not only the need for the critical ethnographic research, we need quantitative surveys, because if we want to actually inform the policy, we need numbers. And numbers are extremely important, where, and how do we then um, work with people who work with big data? So how do we figure out, violence against women with disabilities in these big data surveys? This is going to be another very important question. Um then further, we are thinking about, the participation of the disabled in the research process and the policy making. So right from the beginning, disability rights movement has been making putting it down that, in all levels of decision making, persons with disabilities or allies of persons with disabilities or parents run organizations of persons with disabilities should be made part of this. But over time, one is also seeing that there is a great deal of, kind of chasm emerging between those who do research and those who are activists. And this is not new. This has happened in all movements, all within women's studies also. You have Dalit studies, environmental studies, that, there is a kind of suspicion for research, because research often questions, commonsensical assumptions about disability and how people with disabilities, live in empirical, situations. So, there is a need for all of us to actually come together on all platforms and try to actually talk to each other rather than talking past each other. So in terms of, research also, I think it's very important that, everybody is part of the collaborators, especially the population that you are working with, the group that you are working with. Right from the beginning, you make, and it is very challenging. It is very easy to say, but it is extremely challenging to actually um, uh, to be on the same page with people who you are trying to research, because again, in terms of their capacities to be reflexive, their location, social and economic location, there are many challenges that face us, and it needs a very, very patient and long time consuming process to develop a ethical, project in this context. So, say culturally appropriate ways of taking consent. So most people, poor people with disabilities, or any poor people, they would have a problem with signing a document, for instance. What are you taking signature for? So making, developing culturally appropriate ways of taking consent, non-exploitative modes of conducting research is obviously it is mandatory in this context. So workshops are very useful examples. As I said, Nidhi Goyal has been organizing so many workshops with people where, she comes up with conversations and narratives. And in many researches, you see quasi-participant observation, spending long time with people with disabilities. Unnati has done some wonderful work in this regard. Of course, Rising Flame, Nidhi's work is also exemplary in this context. So emancipatory research, the way, emancipatory research have been, but you need to also be critical of some of these assumptions, because much of it is actually coming from the context where, there is a kind of gap, big gap between the researcher and the research. And here, when you are working on the ground, especially DPOs, for instance, how do we create these models of emancipatory research? So is there a way in which, there are local ways of making these understandings possible, coming at the same wavelength? Vandana Chaudhary has written beautifully about how, though she was a blind, and, she was working with disabled people's organizations in Andhra Pradesh, still she was seen to be an outsider. So what is like, it's not that if you are a person with disabilities, automatically others will accept you. So in a sense that, constant reflection, constant debate is very important to actually develop models which are more ethical of doing research, because research at some level remains, an elite activity. And but it is also important, if any action program has to be formulated, it has to feed into the movement, politics, etc. So I think research is very important, and we have so many new agendas, for figuring out, for focusing, for bringing the center of attention to violence against women with disabilities. And it is possible, as I have seen that these global networks of working with disabled people, I think there is so much learning in this process. We just did a small special issue of COVID-19 and responses and the experience of persons with disability in the South Asian context, in the journal Disability and the Global South. And many papers in this special volume are on women with disabilities in, say, Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and of course India. So, bringing in the South Asian context, where we saw very interestingly that how there is a great deal of similarity between the state policies and the action on the ground. So there is so much of uniformity of experiences at one level, and of course heterogeneity is there, but there are also uniform ways in which the state has often acted in a very knee-jerk way. So how we bring in the state question, and we realized that in this volume that in COVID-19, the violence against women with disabilities was exacerbated. So I think we need to take cues from these researchers for further, setting up agendas for doing research on in this context. So with this, I think I should close. I'll be very happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Nilika. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would like
So should I take the questions?
I would like to open the floor.
Yeah.
You can have a look at the questions in the chat box. And
so there is a question, Priyadarshini, do we have any research data on pregnant and lactating mothers with disabilities? You could look at, there are some journals on community health and research. So you could look up if there is, I have not seen any such research, but I'm sure there would be some research on this. Secondly, on SDGs as well, we have many, like I said, this Rising Flame has written many reports. Then Unnati has done reports. These are largely, the DPOs and NGOs who are doing research on SDGs. But I don't really know. Maybe Nandini and Ashaji would be able to tell if there is any specific research with reference to SDGs in the Indian context.
Yeah, not yet, as I am aware of. There would be some NGO-based researches that are going on, but these are not available in the public platforms.
Yes, that's what I said.
Me too. I haven't read anything on the SDGs, except on an international context. On the Indian context, very little is there.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, that, we are not actually taking development and disability discourse very seriously in academic research. Of course NGOs are doing, but academically I did look at one of the thesis, PhD thesis from University of Hyderabad, where there was some mention to SDGs, but this was like 4-5 years back, but not with reference to violence against women.
I think
this was a more general kind of scenario.
When we look at the SDG collection of data by the government of India, I think it would be good research to go into them, because it's not only what they're collecting, it's also which indicators they're not collecting. So, you get both a kind of view perception of what is felt as important and what is not felt as important. Because since I work also on peace and security, I know the most important indicators on peace are missing. So I'm sure that's the same thing in other issues also, that some of the indicators and every state government has that data. It comes from the ground up. So, for anyone who's doing database studies, it's a good thing for the future.
Yeah. May I have some questions or comments?
Someone's written, I'm doing on violence against women for my PhD. So maybe you've spoken, I think, enough guidance on that.
So I just wanted to ask about the disability culture that you have talked. I mean, how is it possible in a country like India that where one could see that there's a huge gap between the realized potential of a person with disabilities and that of an able-bodied person. So I mean, how is it possible to create such culture? I mean, in Indian society, particularly in the rural areas.
I'm not talking about the desirability of disability culture or not, but there is a fact that people with specific disabilities definitely constitute some kind of a subgroup culture. So I've seen in my own university, say, blind students, and then in this study by Ritika Gulyani on deaf children, in schools, they talk about how after the school also they like to hang out together. Michelle Fridner has also done a study on deaf people in Bangalore, where she talks about how there is a tendency among the deaf youth who want to hang out together, and they basically they feel very happy. So basically what I'm saying is that if you are going to the same kind of institutions, you develop these long-term friendships, and so you tend to develop these subgroup cultures. But cross disability cultures, the way you see in, say, United States, etc., you don't see here. Like Michelle Fridner very clearly talks about, there is no deaf culture in India as such. Yeah.
True. Yeah. Thanks, ma'am.
Actually, in a way, the negativity that is associated with disability itself does not allow this, when we talk about a positive disability identity as the movements in the West have experienced, that is something we are yet to experience in India. The disability identity, disability pride, this kind of movement is yet to be experienced in India. Any other questions?
I think they've had too much of information.
Yes. But thank you both for wonderful presentations. Yeah, Rajni, yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for the great presentation, Nilika ma'am. Great thought. I studied at EFLU, and we have a disability study cell at EFLU University. And one thing which you also pointed out, and I also experienced it during my stay there, that there's a huge disparity in terms of what we preach when it comes to academic studies, and even in terms of what research has been done with the NGOs, and what students actually face in the university or at college level or school level or even at the university level. So what do you think, what can we do as researchers to incorporate or bring the change so that students who have disability and the gap should be bridged? I mean, we make policy, but the implementation, when it comes to the implementation, there's a huge gap.
I think it needs to start from the very grassroots level, from families to schools to institutions. Everywhere, I think some kind of a positivity has to be built. So I think uh, in educational system, unless we incorporate the disability studies perspective,
Yes.
where we learn to respect diversities and differences, I think, and teach our children to be, more accepting of differences. I think this kind of a stereotype will continue, but I am still very hopeful, because I've looked at some studies on school children. One study
Mhm.
came from Lady Irving College recently to me for PhD, evaluation, and it also talks about the fact that how children on their own,
Yeah.
don't really make these distinctions so sharply. Only when they grow older that they are becoming more aware of these prejudices. So somewhere I think they like to see each other as, children, not as, say a deaf child or a blind child. And so there is a very lot of camaraderie within the
Mhm.
families. Also, Shubhangi Vaidya's work also showed that, the siblings are much more accepting of each other, and they are supportive of each other. So but let's accept that, look, life itself is full of conflicts and contestations, and in this context, disability is really marked out very sharply when you are,
Mhm.
and especially disability of the kind that which is seen more as disability. For instance, in my work in Haryana, I found that the deaf people were not stigmatized because they were allowed, they continued with their work, and they were hardly, interacting with others, but they were very good workers and reproducers, etc. But a person with limb deformity was seen to be dependent and also very disabled. So during my fieldwork, there was this boy who with the limb deformities, and he later I heard that he had committed suicide. And why? Because he was constantly bullied. He was constantly bullied, and he didn't have a job. He could not go to the town every day to, figure out a job. He was not really useful in terms of farm work, and he was not able to marry because, as it is, it is very difficult for men to marry in Haryana, because of the skewed sex ratio. And so he was seen to be totally kind of useless, whereas women with disabilities, in this context, I found that all of them were seen to be useful because they would do some work or the other. They were useful as either a worker or as a producer. So I think that is why I'm saying, contexts are very, very important to understand
Yeah.
how disability is played out, and how the violence would be construed or to be experienced by people. This one woman who was in her 70s, and when I tried to actually probe whether she, experienced any discrimination, I was not talking about violence, and she gave back to me very, very harshly. And she said, I have no problem. I have never had problems. I have managed my life very well, and now my daughters help me. So basically, this kind of a confidence, where this confidence is coming from, is it coming from a social support of the kind that she has always had? Is it the kind of, the person she is already, she has a very strong sense of personhood? So I think we need to actually go deeper into the layers of the cultural complexity to understand how the violence works out. Like, for instance, a person with a woman with no children, a child free woman in my context was seen as more disabled than a woman with children,
With
because she would
discipline.
be stigmatized so much that it was difficult for her to live life. So you can imagine, that when these complexities come together and they form different layers, violence becomes something which needs to be figured out very, very carefully.
I don't know, like what you said is totally relevant. My experience was slightly different from one point that you made, like for example, students or learners facing disability in academic space, especially at the college level. Like I work with an NGO that is in Punjab, and my even though my work had started before that, my work with school children started from that very instance. That was a cultural program that was held at the university, and in that program, what they did was like there were two events that were to be performed. One by people with students with disability, and there was another group from Sri Lanka was supposed to perform, and people with no disability. Let's say that. And there was an announcement which was made because that Sri Lankan group performance got cancelled, and they had to announce that. And the terminology which they used was like normal group is not going to perform. So I mean that was something which was very striking for me. Like what I saw that children who, like, we are dealing with school children, and let's say at the age group is, let's say, 8 to 12 years old, and even though we are saying that we are
That
training
is why
them and we
generalizations are
prepare,
difficult.
yeah.
That's why
So the idea
generalizations
was
are
like,
difficult to make.
yeah.
This
So
is
the
what is
my problem was with the terminology that we are using even at a school, which is catering to the needs of people who have these disabilities, and what sort of awareness are we spreading at the level of teaching, for example, because we need special trainers for them, and how far are we accommodative in terms of our language or in terms of our terminology. So even when we talk about the gender disparity, and we say that even if you write a letter and say, do not write dear sir, we have to be accommodative and write dear sir / ma'am. Right? We are trying to generate an inclusive environment language.
This means that
Yeah.
we need to generate maybe more evidence, a little bit of research on how language itself
Yeah.
can be very disabling. How the way
Yeah.
in which we use language, the way in which we mobilize language for certain purposes can be also very
Yes.
disabling processes. And
Yes.
what I think Nilika is pointing out, and I would support it to a great extent, is to look at it, not look at, when you look at lives of disabled people, not look at it only from the negative point of view, but also look at what could be also construed as positive within the frames that we are examining, right? So I'm sorry I have to wrap up the session. Thank you very much to both the
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Of course, you have any queries, you can always write to them. We can share their email IDs with you. I have announcements to make is about the poster presentation for the participants. And as you are aware, we had declared that there would be a poster presentation on the 1st of March. So each of the participants will get 5 minutes to present, and it could be a oral poster, or it could be actually a poster or a presentation that you can make. And the topic would be inclusion of disabled women within the community. So it could be a small presentation about how you envisage this inclusion could take place, how, and the last part would be what would be your personal effort, like if you had the next 6 months to actually do it, how would you be able to put this plan into action at the level of community? Because as we believe, every change can begin at the smallest level. It can begin from the individual and the community level before we can move it to the policy level, because to ask for policy level change, again, we need evidence. So I think that is what we are looking for in this poster presentation. I am giving you the framework now. Each of you will get 5 minutes. It can be a oral presentation. It can be a drawing or something through which you will present a plan for the inclusion of disabled women in the community, right? The second, this poster presentation will also enable us to select the people who will receive the small scholarship that we have for the participants.
Thank you, Nandini, and thank you, Asha ji. Of course, Kathy very good co-panelist. So, and also the participants. Yeah.